What if the breath of God is not a vague spiritual mood, not a poetic fog, and not a shortcut around thinking, but a precise way of naming how life, meaning, and inner transformation arrive in a human being? Stay with me, because Saint Thomas Aquinas treats phrases like this with a kind of disciplined reverence that feels almost shocking today. He refuses to let them dissolve into sentiment, but he also refuses to flatten them into sterile theory. He treats them like a doorway into reality itself. And by the end of this, you'll understand what Aquinas means when faith says the breath of God, why God's breathing cannot mean anything physical, how this language connects to God's life and love, and how it changes the way you understand conscience, courage, and love without slipping into superstition or empty slogans. Before we begin, a quick favor that genuinely helps keep this channel alive. Subscribe, hit like, and leave a comment. It helps the algorithm, and it helps these deep philosophical explorations keep growing. All right, no fluff. Let's go straight in. To understand Aquinas on the breath of God, you have to begin with one of his most important instincts. When we apply human words to God, the words cannot be taken in exactly the same sense as when we apply them to creatures. If we forget that, we end up doing one of two things. We either shrink God down into a creature, like a powerful being inside the universe with supersized human features, or we push God so far away that language becomes meaningless and faith becomes mere emotion. Aquinas refuses both. He insists that we can speak truly about God, but we must speak carefully, because God is the source of everything we're talking about. So when you hear breath of God, your imagination immediately runs toward lungs, air, oxygen, warmth, wind on the skin, or that visible cloud in cold weather. That's normal. But Aquinas would stop you and say, God is not a body. God does not have organs. God does not take in oxygen. God is not a biological thing. So breath of God cannot mean a literal process like creaturely breathing. If you read it that way, you're not reading Aquinas. You're reading your imagination. So why does the tradition use a word like breath at all? Because breath is one of the deepest symbols we have for life. Breath is the constant sign that a living being is alive here and now. Breath is also that strange bridge between interior and exterior. You breathe from within, yet breath moves outward. It's intimate and communicative. Breath is invisible, but it is real, and it changes what it touches. Breath is tied to speech. You speak on breath. Breath carries word. So when Scripture and tradition speak of God's breath, they are using an image that points to life communicated, inner reality expressed, and power that moves without being seen. Aquinas doesn't leave the image floating. He asks, what reality could this image be pointing to? And he answers by drawing a distinction that matters more than it seems, the difference between literal language and analogical language about God. When you say this person is good and God is good, you are not using good in a strictly identical way. But you're also not using it in a totally unrelated way. The word is analogical. It refers to a real likeness, yet it points beyond our creaturely mode. The same is true of breath. It's not literal, but it's not meaningless. It's a sign pointing to something real. So what is it pointing to? In Aquinas, breath of God can be understood on two interlocking levels, and both are essential if you want the full picture. One level is metaphysical, meaning it concerns what it means for anything to exist at all. The other level is spiritual and moral, meaning it concerns what happens inside a rational creature when God is present and active. Start with the metaphysical level, because Aquinas would insist that if you skip this, you'll misunderstand everything else. Aquinas has a radical view of creation. He does not think creation is merely something that happened once, long ago, like a craftsman building a clock, winding it up and walking away. That image is too small. For Aquinas, God is not merely the first push at the beginning of time. God is the reason anything exists right now. The world's existence is a continuous dependence. Your being is not self-sustaining. You don't own existence the way you own a tool. You receive existence. And you receive it not just at the beginning of your life, but continuously, because created being is not something that can stand on its own as if it were its own source. This is one of Aquinas' most powerful and unsettling claims. If God were not sustaining a creature's being, the creature would not merely become independent. It would not continue at all. Not because God is constantly interfering like a tyrant, but because God is the cause of being itself. In Aquinas' metaphysics, God is not one more being among other beings. God is being itself, the source of existence. That's why creation is not merely a past event. It's an ongoing gift. Existence itself is donated moment by moment. So at this level, the breath of God refers to God's life-giving causality, the constant communication of being, the sustaining of existence. It's not a rare mystical experience. It's the deepest ordinary reality. You are held in being. The world is continuously given. That alone changes how you look at your life. It means your existence is not just a fact, it's a gift. It means gratitude is not mere politeness. It's realism. It means you can't finally explain yourself by reducing yourself to biology or circumstance. You can describe how your body works, how your brain functions, how your psychology forms, but none of that explains why there is a reality for any of that to happen in. Aquinas' claim is that existence itself points beyond itself to a source that is not merely another piece inside the system. Now, a modern listener might say, okay, but what does that have to do with the phrase, breath of God? Everything, because breath is the image of life being present. When you say someone is breathing, you're saying they are alive, sustained here. Aquinas reads the tradition's use of breath as a way of saying, life is received, existence is communicated, being is sustained. God's breath is not oxygen, it's the act of giving life, the act of sustaining what exists. But Aquinas doesn't stop at metaphysics. He moves inward to the level that touches your conscience and your choices. How is God present in a human being? Aquinas' answer is not, God is a feeling. He is careful here. Feelings matter, but they are not the foundation. Aquinas describes God's presence as the presence of a cause to its effect. God is present to all things as the cause of their being. That means God is present to you not as an object sitting next to you, but as the reason you exist, the reason you can know, the reason you can choose. God is closer to you than you are to yourself, not as a psychological voice, but as the source of your existence and your powers. This is where Aquinas becomes quietly revolutionary for the modern mind. Modern people often imagine freedom as, nobody moves me, nobody influences me, nobody determines me. But Aquinas would say, that kind of freedom is incoherent. If nothing moves you, you're not free, you're empty, you're a blank page with no ink, incapable of choosing anything at all. Real freedom is not the absence of influence. Real freedom is the ability to see what is true and choose what is good without being enslaved by disordered desire, fear, pride, or confusion. So if God is the source of being and the source of your powers, then God can move you from within without violating your freedom. In fact, Aquinas argues that God's interior motion is what makes your freedom possible. God is the cause of the will's very ability to choose. So God can incline the will toward the good in a way that strengthens freedom rather than cancels it. God doesn't override your will as if your will were a machine to be hijacked. God moves you as the source of your power to choose, helping you to choose rightly, which is what freedom is for. So at this second level, the breath of God refers to God's life, communicated to the soul in a way that heals and elevates. It refers to illumination and strengthening. Illumination means the intellect is helped to see truth more clearly, especially about ultimate things, what you are for, what is worthy, what is truly good, What kind of life is coherent? Strengthening means the will is helped to choose the good more consistently, especially when the good is hard, when fear or habit or appetite pulls you elsewhere. Now we're approaching something central. For Aquinas, the breath of God is not meant to bypass reason. It is meant to strengthen reason and purify desire. It is not meant to make you less human. It is meant to make you more fully human. This leads us to one of Aquinas' most important principles, a sentence that can reshape everything if you really let it land. Grace does not destroy nature. It heals and perfects it. This line is the backbone of Aquinas' spirituality and his moral philosophy. It means that God's action in you is not a cancellation of your humanity. It is not an invitation to become irrational, passive, or detached from reality. It is an elevation of your humanity toward its true end. For Aquinas, the human being is made for truth and for the good, ultimately for God. The human mind is meant to know truth. The human will is meant to love the good. Sin, weakness, and disorder cloud this, and grace heals it and perfects it. So if the breath of God is present in the soul, Aquinas expects it to produce something measurable, not in the sense of laboratory instruments, but in the sense of moral fruit. It should produce a deeper truthfulness, a deeper charity, a deeper self-control, a deeper humility. It should increase your capacity for the good, not feed your ego. It should reorder your loves so that you love what is worthy in a more stable way. And this is a crucial warning, because religious language can be misused. Aquinas would never accept the idea that God's breath makes you more arrogant, more cruel, more entitled, more contemptuous of others. He would say, that's not God's action. That's a disordered soul using sacred language as a costume for pride. God is the highest good. Contact with the highest good purifies rather than corrupts. Now, we need to address something else because the phrase breath of God carries a specifically theological resonance in Christian tradition. It points to the Holy Spirit. Aquinas treats this with philosophical precision. Aquinas argues that within God there are real relations we name as the Trinity. He says the Son proceeds as the Word, the eternal expression of God's self-knowledge, and the Holy Spirit proceeds as love, the eternal expression of God's self-gift. Now, in Latin theology, the procession of the Spirit is described using the language of spiration, a term related to breath. This is not because God exhales air. It's because breath is a human image for life proceeding from within, and the Spirit is described as proceeding as love. So when you ask, what is the breath of God according to Aquinas? You are touching two things at once. You are touching God's creative and sustaining causality, the gift of being, and you are touching the Spirit as the personal expression of God's love communicated. In other words, breath language points to life and love going forth from God, communicated without diminishing God, and received without turning creatures into puppets. But what does that mean for your life, in a way that is not just theology floating above you? It means that if God's breath is life and love communicated, then the presence of God in you would look like your interior life becoming more ordered toward truth and goodness. It would look like your conscience becoming clearer, not merely louder. It would look like courage becoming steadier, not merely impulsive. It would look like love becoming less possessive, more patient, more honest. It would look like your desire for the good becoming stronger than your desire to protect your image. Now, at this point, many people want something dramatic. They want the breath of God to feel like a wave. They want a rush, a certainty, a sensation that proves God is there. Aquinas is careful with this expectation. He does not deny that intense experiences can occur, but he does not build spiritual life on intensity. Why? Because intensity is easily confused with truth. A person can feel intensely and be profoundly mistaken. A person can have a powerful emotional moment and still remain unchanged in character. Aquinas is interested in transformation, not spectacle. For Aquinas, God's action in the soul is often steady, quiet, and structural. It's not always loud. It's not always pleasant. It is often a slow reordering of the interior life, where the intellect becomes more aligned with truth and the will becomes more aligned with the good. This is where the phrase breath of God becomes surprisingly fitting again, because breath is constant. Breath is near. Breath is not usually dramatic. You don't celebrate every breath. You would be exhausted if you did. You live by it. And Aquinas would say, the deepest realities are often like that. They are the conditions of life itself, not the fireworks at the edges of life. So what would Aquinas want you to do with this idea? He would want you to stop treating God as either a distant concept or a private feeling. He would want you to see God as the source of your existence and the source of your transformation. He would want you to judge spirituality not by how mystical it sounds, but by what it produces in the soul. Now let's go even deeper, because Aquinas is not naive about the human interior. He knows how we fracture. He knows how we rationalize. He knows how we excuse. He knows how we can have good intentions and still choose badly. Aquinas' anthropology, his view of the human person, is realistic. The intellect can be clouded, the will can be weakened, the appetites can become disordered. You can know the good and still fail to do it because your interior life is not unified. Many people today describe this experience as anxiety, addiction, impulsivity, self-sabotage, or inner conflict. Aquinas would recognize it immediately, though he would name it differently. He would say, the human powers are wounded and require healing. Virtue is the ordered strength of the powers. Grace is the divine gift that heals and elevates. So if the breath of God is present in the soul, it is not merely comfort. It is often conviction, not condemnation as humiliation, but clarity as mercy. It is the kind of seeing that makes excuses harder to maintain. It is the kind of light that reveals where your loves are disordered. This is why spiritual growth often feels uncomfortable. People expect God's presence to always feel warm, but warmth is not the only sign of life. Fire warms, but it also burns away what cannot remain. Aquinas would say, grace heals and perfects, but healing can sting because it removes what you were using as a substitute for the good. So the breath of God gives life, yet it can feel like dying to yourself. Why? Because you are dying to a false self, a disordered self, a self that survived by control, approval, and comfort. When grace begins to reorder your loves, the ego interprets the loss of control as catastrophe. But Aquinas would say, it is not the death of your humanity. It is the weakening of your chains. It is liberation, even when it feels like loss. Let's bring this down into everyday examples, because Aquinas is not meant to remain in libraries. Aquinas is meant to become a lens for reality. Imagine a person who lives by image. They are constantly managing how they are perceived. They speak in ways that keep them safe. They avoid truth that might cost them status. They make choices that protect comfort. They call this prudence, but it is often fear. They call this wisdom, but it is often self-protection. Now imagine that person begins to experience a new clarity. They start seeing the cost of their image management. They start feeling a weight when they lie, not because they are being policed, but because they are becoming honest. They start wanting to be real more than they want to be admired. They start admitting what they don't know. They start apologizing without justifying themselves. Aquinas would say, this is what grace looks like. This is the breath of God as interior reordering. Or imagine a person addicted to distraction. They constantly fill silence because silence threatens them. Silence is where the truth rises. Silence is where regret speaks. Silence is where conscience becomes audible, so they flood their mind with noise. They call it entertainment, but it is often escape. Now imagine something begins to change. They start tolerating silence. They start enduring the discomfort of being alone with their thoughts. They start praying without performing. They start facing the things they were running from. Aquinas would say, this is not merely a psychological technique. It can be grace at work, strengthening the will, healing the appetites, illuminating the mind. Or imagine love. Aquinas' view of love is not sentimental. Love is the movement of the will toward the good. Love is what you choose as worthy. Love shapes your life because what you love determines what you seek. Disordered love can make you possessive, jealous, controlling, anxious. Ordered love can make you patient, faithful, courageous, stable. So if the breath of God is divine love communicated, it should reorder how you love. It should make love less about possession and more about willing the good of the other. It should make love less about needing someone to save you and more about becoming capable of self-gift. This is why Aquinas connects spiritual life with virtues. Virtues are not moral decoration. They are the stable strengths of a rightly ordered soul. When the breath of God is present, the soul becomes more capable of virtue, not because it becomes robotic, but because it becomes freer. Now we have to address a modern temptation, to treat God as an instrument. People sometimes use religious language as a way to control life, to guarantee outcomes, to avoid uncertainty. They want God's breath to be a sign that everything will go their way. Aquinas would reject this. God is not a tool. God is not a technique. You cannot manipulate God the way you manipulate a method. You can cooperate with grace. You can resist grace. You can pray for grace, but you cannot treat God as a personal device that produces comfort on demand. Aquinas would also insist that faith is not anti-reason. This matters because some people treat spiritual language as a license to abandon thinking. Aquinas is the opposite. For him, reason is a gift from God, and truth is coherent. Faith is not the cancellation of reason. Faith is reason consenting to divine truth with God's help. So breath of God is not a permission slip to be irrational. It is a call to become more aligned with truth. Now, let's return to the Trinity for a moment, not as a detached doctrine, but because it clarifies the meaning of breath. When the tradition speaks of the Spirit as breath, it is pointing to the way love proceeds from within as a living reality. Aquinas argues that the Spirit proceeds as love, as the bond of love, not as an impersonal force, but as a personal reality. Again, this is not a physical proceeding. It is eternal, not temporal. It does not imply change in God. It is a way of naming that God is not solitary in the sense of sterile isolation. God's life includes knowing and loving. God's inner life is fullness, not loneliness. If you let that land, it changes how you understand divine action. It means that when God gives life, God is not filling a void. God is communicating fullness. The breath of God is not God reaching outward because God lacks something. It is God giving because God is abundant. Now bring that back to your life. If the breath of God is the communication of divine life and love, then it is not primarily about your emotional satisfaction. It is about your participation in a higher life that heals you and orders you toward what is truly good. This is where Aquinas becomes both comforting and demanding. Comforting because he says, you are not trapped in your habits. You can change. You are not doomed to be the person your worst impulses insist you are. Demanding because he insists that change is not just wishing. It is cooperation with grace. It is discipline. It is virtue. It is becoming a certain kind of person. Aquinas would say, you cannot honestly claim to be living by God's breath if you are not becoming more truthful, more charitable, more humble, more self-controlled. Not perfect, but directed. Spiritual life is not a costume. It is a trajectory. Now let's talk about one more deep Aquinas idea that changes how you interpret breath. The distinction between nature and grace and the concept of participation. Aquinas believes that creatures have their own real powers. Nature is real. Your mind is real. Your will is real. Your bodily life is real. Your psychology is real. Grace does not erase that. Grace builds on it. But Aquinas also believes that there is an end for human beings that exceeds natural power, union with God. You cannot reach this end by natural power alone. You need grace. Grace is not simply moral encouragement. It is a created participation in divine life. It is God giving you a share, not in God's essence, but in God's life, so that you can live toward an end that your nature alone could not attain. This is where the phrase, breath of God, becomes even more profound. Breath suggests participation in life. To breathe is to participate in the condition of being alive. For Aquinas, grace is like a new kind of breathing. It is the soul's participation in a higher life. That doesn't mean you stop being human. It means your humanity is elevated. Now, if you're listening from the United States, this may clash with a cultural reflex we have, the reflex toward autonomy as the highest good. We like the story of self-made identity. We like the story of self-creation. We like the story of being beholden to no one. Aquinas would say, that story is psychologically seductive, but metaphysically false. You are not self-made in the deepest sense. You are received. Your existence is received. Your capacities are received. Even your freedom is a received power. That doesn't humiliate you in Aquinas's view. It grounds you. It gives you a stable worth that does not depend on performance. And then Aquinas would add, if your existence is received, then the most reasonable posture is not pride, but gratitude. Not entitlement, but humility. Not despair, but trust. Now, humility in Aquinas is not self-hatred. It is accuracy about your place in reality. It is living in truth about who you are. A creature with dignity, not a god. A rational being with responsibility, not a machine. A person called to love, not a consumer called to indulge. So when Aquinas speaks of God's breath, he is not inviting you to float away from the world. He is inviting you to stand more solidly in reality. Now let's face a difficult question that will probably arise. If God's breath sustains all things, why do human beings suffer? Why do people break? Why do people feel empty? Why does the world look so fractured? Aquinas does not offer a simplistic answer. He distinguishes between God as the cause of being and creatures as causes of their own actions. The world includes freedom. Freedom can be misused. Disordered desire can corrupt action. Systems can become unjust. Bodies can fail. Nature itself is not yet the fullness of glory. It is a realm where change, limitation, and decay exist. God's sustaining causality does not imply that creatures will never suffer. It implies that suffering does not have the final word over being. But Aquinas would also say, God's breath in the soul is not primarily about removing every pain. It is about ordering you toward the ultimate good, which can include the strength to endure pain without becoming bitter, the clarity to face truth without collapsing, the charity to love even when it costs, the humility to accept limits without despair. In other words, Aquinas's view is not God's breath will make your life easy. It is God's breath can make you real. Now, real is a dangerous word, because becoming real means losing illusions. It means losing your favorite stories that protect your ego. It means confronting the gap between what you say you love and what you actually pursue. It means recognizing where your habits are shaping your character. It means accepting responsibility without self-condemnation. Aquinas believes the spiritual life is about integration. The fragmented self becomes unified. The mind becomes clearer. The will becomes stronger. The appetites become ordered. This is why virtue matters. Virtue is not mere rule following. Virtue is the stable harmony of the soul's powers. Virtue is what it looks like when the breath of God is shaping your interior life over time. So if you want a practical Aquinas test for the breath of God, it's not, did I feel a rush? It's, am I becoming more capable of truth and goodness? Am I becoming less enslaved to fear, less enslaved to craving, less enslaved to approval, more capable of patience, more capable of honesty, more capable of charity, more capable of self-control? And notice something subtle. Aquinas is not telling you to become a stone. He's not telling you to become emotionless. He's telling you to become ordered. He's telling you to have emotions that serve the good rather than sabotage it. He's telling you to have desires that align with reality rather than fight it. Now let's connect this to something that many people misunderstand: conscience. In Aquinas, conscience is not merely a feeling of guilt. Conscience is the application of moral knowledge to a particular act. It is the mind judging, this is right, this is wrong, this should be chosen, this should be avoided. Conscience can be informed or malformed. It can be clear or confused. It can be honest or self-serving. When the breath of God is present as illumination, conscience becomes clearer, not because you become morally perfect overnight, but because you begin to see more accurately. You begin to see the real consequences of your choices. You begin to see your own rationalizations. You begin to see that "I had to" is often a mask for "I wanted to." That clarity can feel harsh, but Aquinas would call it mercy, because without clarity, you drift. You become the sum of your impulses. You become a person who reacts instead of chooses. And that is not freedom. That is slavery. So the breath of God in Aquinas is connected to freedom. Freedom is not the ability to choose anything at random. Freedom is the ability to choose the good with stability. Freedom is the soul becoming capable of what it was made for. Now let's talk about prayer, because breath of God language often appears in prayerful contexts, and people sometimes imagine prayer as a way of calling down an experience. Aquinas sees prayer differently. Prayer is not manipulating God. Prayer is aligning yourself with reality. It is the creature turning toward the source. It is the rational being consenting to the truth that your life is received and your end is beyond yourself. Prayer is, in a sense, learning to breathe rightly. Not to force God to breathe into you like an external gas, but to become receptive to what is already sustaining you, to cooperate with grace rather than resist it. This changes the way you interpret spiritual dryness. Many people feel dry and assume God is absent. Aquinas would not conclude that so quickly. God sustains being regardless of feeling. God can be present even when you feel nothing. Sometimes dryness reveals that you were seeking the feeling rather than the good. Sometimes dryness purifies intention. Sometimes dryness trains perseverance. Aquinas' spirituality is not built on constant emotional confirmation. So the breath of God is not a mood you can command. It is the deepest condition of life and the deepest gift of transformation. Now I want to address a modern tension, especially for an American audience, the tension between faith and intellectual honesty. Aquinas is a model of intellectual honesty. He does not fear questions. He does not fear objections. He often presents the strongest objections against his own position before he answers. He believes truth can withstand scrutiny because truth is coherent. So if you are drawn to the phrase breath of God, but you dislike fuzzy thinking, Aquinas is your ally. He refuses fuzziness. He insists that God is not a vague force. God is the source of being, and God's action in the soul has structure. He will not let you confuse faith with fantasy. He will not let you confuse spirituality with escapism. He will not let you confuse God with a psychological projection. Now, there's a final layer we need to talk about if we want the full Aquinas answer: the way breath language connects to word and love. Remember earlier, breath carries speech. You speak on breath. In the Christian tradition, the Son is called the Word. Aquinas treats this as more than metaphor. He says, in God, there is an eternal act of knowing, and the Son proceeds as the Word, God's self-knowledge. Then the Spirit proceeds as love, as the bond of love. So breath and word and love become a kind of triangle of meaning. Breath carries word. Word expresses knowledge. Love unites. When the tradition calls the Spirit breath, it is not just saying life. It is saying love communicated. And for Aquinas, love is not mere feeling. Love is willing the good. So the breath of God is love, and love is the movement toward the good, and the good is what fulfills the creature. That means divine breath is not just energy, it is moral and spiritual direction. It points the soul toward the good it was made for. This is why Aquinas believes that spiritual life must produce charity. Charity in Aquinas is not mere kindness. It is love of God above all and love of neighbor for God's sake. It is the soul participating in God's own love. This is what it means to be breathed into by divine love. Your love becomes less self-centered. You begin to will the good of others more purely. You begin to care without needing control. You begin to serve without needing applause. You begin to forgive without humiliating yourself or the other. You begin to desire justice without losing mercy. You begin to endure without hardening. That's not weakness. That is strength with order. Now, let's pause and be honest. This kind of transformation is rare. Not because grace is rare, but because cooperation is hard. Your ego does not want to die. Your habits do not want to change. Your comforts do not want to be threatened. Your illusions do not want to be exposed. Aquinas would say, that is the battlefield of spiritual life. Not external drama, but interior resistance. So when you hear breath of God, you should not think first of spectacle. You should think of the slow war of love against disordered love. You should think of truth breaking through rationalization. You should think of the will strengthening against fear. You should think of the soul becoming more unified. Now, I want to give you a moment of deep, practical clarity, because the Paradox Garden is not here to impress you with concepts. It's here to help you see. If you are trying to discern whether something in your life is genuinely from God in Aquinas' sense, ask yourself, does it move me toward truth and goodness in a stable way? Does it produce humility, charity, patience, self-control? Does it make me more honest? Does it make me more courageous? Does it make me less enslaved to approval? Does it make me more capable of love without control? Aquinas would say, those are the signs of grace. Those are signs of the breath of God as interior reordering. And if something produces the opposite, even if it is wrapped in religious language, Aquinas would call it suspect. If it produces pride, contempt, division, cruelty, manipulation, or obsession with superiority, Aquinas would say it is not divine breath. It is a disordered spirit of the ego, even if it uses holy vocabulary. Now, you might be wondering, if God's breath sustains all things, why isn't everyone transformed like this? Aquinas would point again to freedom and cooperation. God gives. The creature receives. Grace is offered, but it can be resisted. The will can turn away. The appetites can dominate. The mind can choose darkness because darkness feels safer. And sometimes the world forms people in ways that make the good hard to see. Aquinas is not naive about how history, trauma, and environment shape the soul. But he still insists that grace can heal, even if healing is slow. So the breath of God is both universal and personal. Universal in the sense that God sustains all existence. Personal in the sense that grace addresses you as a rational creature capable of consent. God is not forcing your soul like a machine. God is inviting your will like a beloved. That invitation can be accepted, delayed, negotiated with, or resisted. And this brings us to a final paradox that Aquinas would want you to sit with. If God is so close, why do we feel so alone? Because closeness to the source is not always felt as closeness emotionally. A child can be loved and still feel lonely. A person can be surrounded and still feel isolated. Feelings do not always measure reality. Aquinas would tell you, Do not confuse emotional experience with metaphysical truth. God can be sustaining you even when you feel nothing. God can be calling you even when you are numb. God can be healing you even when the healing feels like discomfort. God can be present even when you are restless. So the question becomes, are you willing to be faithful to reality rather than to mood? That's a hard question. It's also one of the most liberating questions you can ask yourself. Now, let's gather everything into a single clear answer, because I don't want this to remain a cloud. According to Saint Thomas Aquinas, the breath of God is not physical air. It is the life-giving communication of being and love. It refers to God's sustaining act that keeps creatures in existence. It also points, in theological language, to the Holy Spirit as the procession of divine love, and to grace as the participation in divine life that heals and perfects the human soul. In human experience, this breath is recognized not primarily by dramatic feeling, but by the fruit of a soul becoming more aligned with truth and goodness, more capable of virtue, more free to love rightly. Now I want to turn this into a living question, because philosophy becomes real at the edge of choice. If you had to choose one sign that the breath of God is real in a person's life, what would it be? Is it peace that doesn't collapse under pressure? Is it courage that doesn't need applause? Is it self-control that doesn't turn cold? Is it charity that doesn't become naive? Which one feels like the clearest evidence to you, and why? Drop your answer in the comments. I genuinely read them, and they shape what we explore next in the Paradox Garden. And if you want more grounded, reflective philosophy that respects faith without turning it into superstition, subscribe, hit like, and leave a comment. It helps more than people realize, and it keeps this channel alive.